Before we talk about heroes wearing uniforms or carrying rifles, let me tell you about a weapon the Nazis never saw coming. Picture this: a 10-year-old girl with blonde braids, clutching a porcelain doll against her chest, walking straight through a German checkpoint in occupied Belgium. The soldiers smile at her. One even pats her head. They have no idea that inside that innocent doll's hollow body, wrapped in cloth to prevent rattling, sits enough dynamite to level an entire Nazi command post. This is not fiction. This is not Hollywood. This happened. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this little girl's story was buried for decades, why her name barely appears in history books, and why what she did might be one of the most dangerous missions any child has ever undertaken in wartime. The year was 1943, and across occupied Europe, the Nazi war machine controlled every road, every bridge, every checkpoint. But they couldn't control the one thing that would ultimately help bring them down: the underestimation of innocence. Belgium in 1943 was a country suffocating under the iron grip of German occupation. 3 years had passed since Wehrmacht tanks rolled through the streets of Brussels, and by now, the initial shock had transformed into something far more insidious: routine oppression. Checkpoints appeared on every major road. Curfews were enforced with brutal efficiency. Anyone caught with weapons, explosives, or even suspicious documents faced immediate execution, often in public squares as a warning to others. The Gestapo had perfected the art of terror, and Belgian citizens learned to keep their heads down, their mouths shut, and their resistance fantasies to themselves. But beneath this surface of compliance, something extraordinary was happening. Their network of ordinary people, shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, and even children, had begun to organize. They called themselves the Resistance, though that word barely captures the desperate, improvised nature of their operations. These weren't trained soldiers. They were bakers who hid Allied pilots in their basements, postmen who carried coded messages in their satchels, and yes, children who could move through the occupiers' world like ghosts because no one suspected them of anything more dangerous than playing hopscotch. Among these unlikely warriors was a girl we'll call Marie, though that wasn't her real name. In the underground networks of wartime Belgium, real names were luxuries no one could afford. Marie lived in a small town outside Liège, in a modest house with her mother, a seamstress who spent her days mending German uniforms while secretly stitching maps into their linings. Her father had disappeared 2 years earlier, arrested for reasons the family never fully understood. One day he was there, the next gone, swallowed by the machinery of occupation that turned thousands of Belgian men into ghosts. Marie's childhood, like that of countless others, had been stolen by circumstances beyond her control. But unlike most children who simply endured, Marie found a way to fight back. It started small, as these things always do. A message carried to a neighbor, a packet of bandages delivered to a safe house. The resistance cell in her town quickly realized what many partisan groups across Europe were discovering. Children were invisible. Soldiers searched adults. They interrogated teenagers. But a little girl with a doll. She was scenery, background noise, harmless. The boneka, the doll, was a family heirloom passed down from Marie's grandmother. It stood about 12 inches tall, with a porcelain face painted in the style of the late 1800s. Delicate features frozen in a permanent expression of serene innocence. The body was cloth, stuffed with sawdust, and the dress was hand-stitched lace, yellowed with age. It was the kind of doll that belonged in a glass case admired but never played with. But war transforms everything, even heirlooms. Someone in the resistance, a man with experience in demolitions, realized that the doll's cloth body could be carefully opened, emptied, and refilled. Not with sawdust, but with something far more volatile. The porcelain head and hands would remain intact, preserving the illusion. A child carrying such a doll would seem to be treasuring a precious possession, holding tight to a fragment of normalcy in a world gone mad. No German soldier, no matter how suspicious or well-trained, would think to examine it closely. It was perfect camouflage, hiding death inside innocence. Marie's first mission came on a cold morning in February. The resistance needed to move a small quantity of plastic explosives from a rural hiding spot to a contact in the city, about 15 kilometers away. The route required passing through 2 German checkpoints. both heavily manned since a recent sabotage attack on a nearby railway line had put the occupiers on high alert. Any adult carrying a package would be searched thoroughly, possibly arrested on suspicion alone. But a child walking to visit relatives carrying nothing but a doll and a small bag of bread. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Marie's mother prepared the doll the night before, working by candlelight in the cellar. She carefully unseamed the doll's back, removed the sawdust, and created a cavity large enough to hold the tightly wrapped explosives. Cloth was packed around the payload to prevent any sound or movement. The doll, when reassembled, looked and felt exactly as it always had. Except now, it carried enough destructive power to kill everyone in the room. Marie watched the entire process in silence, understanding with a child's clarity that her life was about to change forever. The next morning, as pale winter sun broke through the clouds over occupied Belgium, Marie kissed her mother goodbye, tucked the doll under her arm, and stepped onto the road that would lead her straight into the heart of danger. She was 10 years old. She was terrified. And she was about to walk directly through a Nazi checkpoint, carrying enough explosives to be executed on the spot, if discovered. This is where the story truly begins, in that moment between safety and catastrophe, between childhood and something else entirely. The checkpoints were waiting, the soldiers were watching, and Marie, with her blonde braids and porcelain doll, was already walking toward them, one small step at a time. The first checkpoint appeared exactly where Marie had been told it would be, at the crossroads, where the rural farm road met the main highway leading into the city. From a distance, it looked almost temporary, like something that could be packed up and moved at a moment's notice. But as Marie drew closer, the reality of German efficiency revealed itself. Wooden barriers painted in stark black and white stripes forced all traffic into a single narrow lane. Sandbag fortifications flanked both sides, with machine gun positions clearly visible behind them. 3 soldiers stood in the road itself, rifles slung across their chests, examining papers and searching vehicles with methodical precision. A military truck was parked off to the side, and Marie could see more soldiers inside, smoking cigarettes and watching the road with bored expressions. This was routine for them, just another morning of occupation duty. For Marie, clutching her doll tighter with each step, it was the most terrifying moment of her young life. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run back home, to abandon this insane mission. But she kept walking, because turning back now would look suspicious, and because somewhere in the city people were waiting for what she carried. The key to surviving a checkpoint, Marie had been instructed, was to act exactly like what you appeared to be, a child on an errand. Not too confident, which would seem rehearsed, not too nervous, which would trigger suspicion. Just ordinary, forgettable, invisible. As she approached the barrier, one of the soldiers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, stepped forward and raised his hand in a casual stopping gesture. He said something in German, words Marie didn't fully understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. "Stop papers, where are you going?" Marie reached into her coat pocket with her free hand, the other still gripping the doll against her chest, and produced the travel document her mother had obtained through carefully cultivated connections. It was genuine, stamped with official seals, permitting a minor to travel to visit family in Liège. The soldier took it, glanced at it briefly, then looked down at Marie with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, just indifferent. He asked another question in German. Marie responded in French, her voice small and shy, explaining that she was going to see her aunt who was sick. The words came out exactly as rehearsed, but inside, her heart hammered so hard she was certain the soldier could hear it. What happened next would haunt Marie for the rest of her life. The soldier smiled, a brief flicker of warmth crossing his young face, and he switched to broken French. He asked about the doll, commenting that it looked very old, very beautiful. Without waiting for permission, he reached out and touched the porcelain face with one gloved finger, tilting the doll's head slightly to examine it better. Marie felt her entire body go rigid. The doll, her precious deadly cargo, was now in the hands of fate itself. If he decided to examine it more closely, if he squeezed the body and felt something wrong, if he noticed the weight was unusual for a cloth doll, everything would end right here. She would be arrested, possibly shot, and her mother would be dragged from their home within the hour. The resistance cell would be compromised. People would die, all because of a soldier's casual curiosity about an antique doll. Time stretched into something elastic and surreal. The soldier held the doll for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Then he handed it back to Marie, patted her head in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, and waved her through the checkpoint with her papers. Just like that, the moment passed. The first barrier lifted, and Marie walked through it, her legs shaking so badly she worried she might fall. She forced herself to maintain a normal walking pace, even though every fiber of her being wanted to sprint away from that checkpoint as fast as possible. She could feel the soldier's eyes on her back, watching her go, and she knew that any sudden movement, any sign of panic, could bring them running after her. So she walked like a child walks when sent on an errand, steady, perhaps a little bored, slightly distracted. She even paused once to adjust her coat, a gesture so natural and unrehearsed that it was perfect camouflage. Only when she rounded a bend in the road and the checkpoint disappeared from view behind a line of trees did she allow herself to exhale fully. Her hands were trembling. The doll felt heavier now, as if the close call had added physical weight to its already terrible burden. But she had made it through the first checkpoint. 1 down, 1 more to go. The city was still kilometers away, and the second checkpoint, she had been warned, was even more thorough than the first. The road into Liège cut through farmland that had been stripped bare by years of war. Fields that should have been planted with winter wheat stood empty, or had been converted into military supply depots. Marie passed abandoned farmhouses, their windows blown out, their doors hanging loose on broken hinges. Once she saw a group of forced labourers, Belgian men with yellow identification patches, digging trenches under the supervision of German guards. They didn't look up as she passed, and she didn't look at them. Everyone in occupied Belgium had learned the survival skill of selective blindness, of not seeing things that could get you killed for witnessing. The February cold bit through her thin coat, and her fingers ached from clutching the doll so tightly, but she didn't dare relax her grip. This doll, this weapon disguised as innocence, was now the center of her entire world. Everything depended on protecting it, on getting it to its destination, on completing a mission that no child should ever have been asked to undertake. The second checkpoint was waiting somewhere ahead, and with each step closer, Marie tried to prepare herself for another encounter with the machinery of occupation. The second checkpoint materialized through the morning mist like something out of a nightmare, far more imposing than the first. This was no temporary roadblock, but a permanent installation, complete with a guardhouse, concrete barriers arranged in a zigzag pattern to slow down any vehicle, and at least 8 soldiers visible from Marie's position on the road. This checkpoint controlled access to the city itself, the final barrier between the occupied countryside and the urban center where resistance activities were most closely monitored. The Germans had learned from experience that cities bred rebellion, that narrow streets and apartment buildings provided cover for saboteurs and spies, so they scrutinized everyone entering with paranoid intensity. Marie could see civilians lined up ahead of her, farmers with carts, women carrying baskets, an elderly man on a bicycle. Each one was being questioned, searched, sometimes pulled aside for additional interrogation. The process was slow, deliberate, designed as much to intimidate as to catch actual threats. Marie joined the queue, positioning herself behind a woman with 2 young children who were crying from cold and hunger. She tried to make herself small, unremarkable, just another child in a line of suffering people trying to navigate the daily humiliation of occupation. As the line inched forward, Marie had time to observe the soldiers more carefully, and what she saw made her stomach tighten with fresh fear. These weren't the young, relatively inexperienced troops manning the rural checkpoint. These were older men, harder faces, veterans who had probably seen action on the Eastern Front and been rotated back to occupation duty. One of them, a sergeant with Iron Cross ribbons on his uniform, was conducting the searches with methodical thoroughness that bordered on obsession. He opened every bag, inspected every package, ran his hands along the seams of coats, looking for hidden pockets. He questioned each person extensively, comparing their answers against documents, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate deception. This was a man who took his job seriously, who understood that the resistance was real and active, who knew that explosives and weapons were being moved right under German noses. Marie watched him pat down a teenage boy, finding nothing, but still sending the boy to a secondary inspection area where 2 more soldiers conducted an even more invasive search. The message was clear: no one passes without thorough examination. No exceptions. When the woman with the crying children reached the sergeant, he barely glanced at her papers before waving her through, apparently deciding that a harried mother was beneath suspicion. The children's wailing had become so loud and persistent that the soldiers seemed eager to move them along just to restore quiet. Marie was next. She stepped forward, the doll pressed against her chest, and handed over her travel document with a hand that she prayed wasn't visibly shaking. The sergeant took the paper and studied it with far more attention than the first soldier had given it. He read every line, checked the stamp against some reference document he pulled from his pocket, then looked down at Marie with eyes that revealed nothing. He asked her destination in German. She replied in French. He switched languages with perfect fluency, unusual for a common soldier, and began asking questions. Where exactly did her aunt live? What street? What number? What was her aunt's full name? How long was Marie planning to stay? These weren't casual questions. They were an interrogation designed to catch a child in a lie, to see if the story held up under pressure. Marie answered each question exactly as she had been coached, providing specific details that made the story believable. Her aunt lived on Rue de la Cathédrale, number 47, second floor. Her name was Elizabeth Dubois. Marie would stay for 3 days to help care for her, because she had pneumonia and couldn't manage alone. The details flowed smoothly because they were true, or at least half true. There really was an Aunt Elizabeth, though she wasn't actually sick, and the address was real, a safe house used by the resistance to receive deliveries exactly like the one Marie was making. The sergeant listened, his expression unchanging. Then his eyes dropped to the doll. He asked what it was, though the answer was obvious. Marie explained that it was her grandmother's doll, that she never traveled without it, that it was her most precious possession. The words were true, which gave them authenticity. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that this precious possession was also a bomb waiting to be delivered to people who would use it to kill German soldiers, just like the one standing in front of her right now. The sergeant reached out and Marie's world stopped. He took the doll from her arms, not roughly but firmly, the way an adult takes something from a child when they want to examine it properly. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly, looking at the porcelain face from different angles. He squeezed the cloth body gently, testing its consistency. Marie stopped breathing. This was it. This was the moment everything would unravel. The explosives inside were wrapped carefully, but if he squeezed too hard, if he felt something unusual, if his experienced hands detected the difference between sawdust and plastic explosive wrapped in cloth, she was dead. The woman behind her in line shifted impatiently. Another soldier called out something in German, asking the sergeant to hurry up. The morning was cold, and everyone wanted this line to move faster. The sergeant squeezed the doll's body one more time, his fingers probing the cloth torso where death itself was hidden just centimeters from his touch. Then, incredibly, miraculously, he handed the doll back to Marie, returned her papers, and waved her through the checkpoint with a dismissive gesture. She had passed. Again. Somehow, impossibly, she had walked through the most dangerous barrier in the entire region, while carrying enough explosives to destroy a building, and the Germans had let her go. Marie walked into the city of Liège in a state of shock so profound that the streets seemed to blur around her like a watercolor painting left in the rain. Her legs moved automatically, carrying her forward along the cobblestone roads, while her mind remained frozen at that checkpoint, replaying the moment when the sergeant had squeezed the doll's body over and over again. How had he not felt it? How had trained fingers accustomed to detecting hidden weapons and contraband missed what was literally in the palm of his hand? Later, much later, Marie would understand that sometimes survival depends less on perfection and more on the assumptions people make. The sergeant expected threats to come from adults, from obvious places, from people who looked nervous or guilty. Our 10-year-old girl clutching a family heirloom simply didn't register in his mental catalogue of dangers. The Resistance had understood this psychological blind spot and exploited it ruthlessly. They had turned innocence itself into a weapon, and Marie was proof that it worked. But in that moment, walking through streets patrolled by German soldiers and collaborationist police, she felt no triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. The address she had been given was in the old quarter of Liège, a maze of narrow medieval streets that had somehow survived centuries of war and occupation. Number 47. Rue de la Cathédrale was a tall, thin building squeezed between a shuttered bakery and a fabric shop that appeared to be doing legitimate business despite the occupation. Marie climbed the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the cold stairwell, and knocked on the door using the specific pattern she had memorized. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more knocks, pause, 1 final knock. The door opened immediately, as if someone had been waiting directly behind it, and a woman's hand reached out, grabbed Marie by the arm, and pulled her inside so quickly she barely had time to register what was happening. The door closed and locked behind her with a decisive click. The apartment was dark, curtains drawn against the daylight, and it took Marie's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she found herself facing 3 people: the woman who had pulled her inside, middle-aged with grey streaks in her dark hair, and 2 men, one young and nervous-looking, the other older with the calm demeanour of someone who had done this many times before. None of them smiled, none of them offered greetings or thanks. The older man simply held out his hand and said one word in French: doll. Marie handed over the porcelain doll without hesitation, suddenly desperate to be free of it, to transfer this terrible responsibility to someone else. The older man took it to a table near the window, where thin blades of light penetrated the curtains, and with practiced efficiency he began to disassemble it. His fingers worked quickly, opening the seam along the doll's back that Marie's mother had so carefully stitched the night before. He reached inside and extracted the package of explosives, unwrapping the cloth to inspect the payload with an expert eye. He weighed it in his hand, nodded with satisfaction, then looked at Marie for the first time with something approaching respect. He told her she had done well, that this delivery was crucial, that what she carried would be used in an operation against a German ammunition depot scheduled for next week. Then he added something that made Marie's blood run cold. They needed her to do it again. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The doll would be refilled, and she would make another journey, because the Resistance had discovered that this method worked too well to abandon after just one success. Marie was no longer just a child who had helped once. She had become an asset, a repeatable resource in the underground war against occupation. The woman, who introduced herself only as Marguerite, offered Marie bread and weak tea, the first food she had eaten since leaving home that morning. While Marie ate, Marguerite explained that she would need to stay in the apartment for several hours before returning home, a security measure to ensure she hadn't been followed, and to let the checkpoints change shifts so different soldiers would see her on the return journey. Marie sat at the table, the now empty doll resting beside her, and tried to process what had just happened to her life. This morning she had been a child forced by circumstance into one terrifying act of bravery. Now she was being told that this would become routine, that she would walk through those checkpoints again and again, each time carrying death disguised as innocence, each time gambling with her life and her mother's life and the lives of everyone in their resistance cell. The young nervous man, who hadn't spoken yet, suddenly asked Marguerite if this was right, if they should be using a child this way. His question hung in the air like smoke. Marguerite's response was cold and factual. The Germans were using children as forced labor, as human shields, as victims of their extermination camps. The Resistance would use whatever weapons they had available, and if that weapon was a little girl with a doll, then so be it. War had no room for squeamishness about age or innocence. Marie finished her bread in silence and stared at the doll, now just a harmless toy again, empty of its deadly cargo. She thought about the soldiers at the checkpoints, especially the sergeant who had held this doll in his hands and never suspected that he was holding his own death. She thought about her father, disappeared into the machinery of occupation, probably dead in some camp or ditch. She thought about all the other children across occupied Europe who had lost their childhoods to this war, who had been forced to grow up too fast, to make impossible choices, to carry burdens no child should ever know. And she realized, sitting in that dark apartment while German patrols passed in the street below, that she had already made her choice. She would do it again. She would walk through those checkpoints as many times as necessary, carrying her deadly cargo, because the alternative was to do nothing while the occupation ground on forever. At 10 years old, Marie had become a soldier in a war that most people would never know she fought. The doll sat on the table between her and the adults, a silent witness to the transformation of innocence into something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous than any German soldier could have imagined. Over the following months, Marie made the journey 7 more times. 7 trips through those checkpoints, 7 times carrying explosives hidden inside her grandmother's porcelain doll. 7 gambles with death that somehow, impossibly, she kept winning. Each mission followed the same basic pattern, but with variations designed to avoid establishing a predictable routine that might attract attention. Sometimes she traveled on different days of the week. Sometimes she carried the doll in her arms, other times in a small bag with bread and other innocent items. Once she even traveled with her mother, the two of them pretending to visit relatives together, the doll tucked casually between them on the train. The resistance handlers understood that repetition bred danger, that eventually some sharp-eyed soldier might remember the girl with the antique doll and start asking questions. So they varied everything they could while maintaining the core deception. A child was invisible, and a treasured toy was above suspicion. With each successful delivery, the network's confidence in this method grew, and with it, the quantities of explosives Marie was asked to transport increased. The doll's hollow body was modified to carry more payload, packed so tightly that Marie sometimes feared the porcelain face might crack from the internal pressure. The psychological toll of these missions accumulated in ways Marie couldn't have anticipated. She began having nightmares where the doll exploded in her arms at the checkpoint, or where soldiers opened it and pulled out the explosives while she stood frozen, unable to run or explain. She developed a ritual of talking to the doll before each mission, whispering to it as if it were alive, asking it to protect her one more time. Her mother watched these transformations with growing anguish, knowing that her daughter was losing something irreplaceable with each journey, some essential quality of childhood that could never be recovered. But they were trapped in the logic of war, where stopping now would mean that all the previous risks had been for nothing, and where the resistance depended on Marie's unique ability to move freely through the German security apparatus. The handlers praised her courage, told her she was saving lives, reminded her that the explosives she delivered were destroying Nazi ammunition depots, fuel reserves, and communication centers. They showed her newspaper reports of successful sabotage operations, though they never explicitly confirmed which ones had used her deliveries. Marie wanted to feel pride in these accomplishments, but mostly she felt tired, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion into something deeper and more permanent. The closest call came on her 5th mission, in late spring when the occupation forces were on high alert, following a wave of resistance attacks across Belgium. The checkpoint protocols had been intensified, with every traveler being searched more thoroughly and additional security measures put in place. Marie approached the now familiar barriers with the doll clutched against her chest, but immediately sensed something different in the atmosphere. The soldiers were tense, aggressive, shouting at people in the line to move faster and submit to searches without complaint. A new officer, someone Marie had never seen before, was supervising the checkpoint, walking back and forth behind his men and barking orders in rapid German. When Marie's turn came, the soldier who took her papers looked nervous, glancing repeatedly at the officer as if afraid of making a mistake. He asked Marie the standard questions, but before she could finish answering, the officer intervened, striding over and demanding to see what the child was carrying. The soldier explained it was just a doll, an antique by the look of it, nothing suspicious. The officer wasn't satisfied. He ordered the soldier to inspect it thoroughly, to take it apart if necessary, to check for hidden compartments or contraband. Marie's heart stopped. This was the nightmare scenario she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times, but never actually believed would happen. The soldier reached for the doll, but Marie did something unplanned, something born of pure instinct rather than training. She burst into tears. Not fake theatrical crying designed to manipulate, but genuine terror-fueled sobbing. The kind of crying that only a child under unbearable stress can produce. She clutched the doll tighter and began speaking rapidly in French, begging them not to take it, explaining through gasping breaths that it was all she had left of her grandmother who had died, that her father was gone and her aunt was sick, and this doll was the only thing that made her feel safe. The words poured out in a torrent of authentic emotion, because in that moment, Marie wasn't acting. She was a terrified 10-year-old girl who knew she was about to be discovered, arrested, probably executed, and the grief and fear that she had been suppressing for months erupted all at once. The soldier looked uncomfortable, then glanced at the officer for guidance. Other people in the line were watching now, witnessing a child's breakdown, and the officer could see that this was creating a scene that was slowing down the checkpoint's operation. The officer made a calculation in that moment, the kind of cold, pragmatic decision that defined the occupation's daily operations. Was thoroughly searching a crying child's doll worth the time and disruption it would cause? Was there really any credible threat from a 10-year-old girl having an emotional breakdown over a family heirloom? He had a line of 50 people waiting to be processed, limited soldiers to do the work and orders to maintain traffic flow into the city. He told the soldier to return the doll and move the line along. Just like that, Marie was waved through, still crying, clutching the doll that contained enough explosives to kill everyone at that checkpoint. She walked into the city in a daze, barely able to process that she had survived, that her genuine breakdown had accomplished what no amount of careful preparation could have achieved. It had made her real, human, sympathetic, in a way that rendered her completely invisible as a threat. When she delivered the payload that day, her hands were shaking so badly that Marguerite had to help her hold the teacup. That night, alone in the safe house before the return journey, Marie made a decision. She would do one more mission, just one, and then she would tell them she couldn't continue. She had pushed her luck too far, survived too many close calls, and even at 10 years old she understood that eventually the odds would catch up with her. But Marie never got the chance to make that final mission. Events larger than any single person's story were already in motion, grinding toward a conclusion that would reshape everything. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion had succeeded in Normandy, and German forces across occupied Europe were beginning their slow, brutal retreat. The checkpoints that Marie had passed through so many times became more dangerous and more desperate as the occupation forces realized they were losing control. Soldiers who had been bored and complacent now searched with paranoid intensity, knowing that every civilian might be hiding weapons for the rapidly advancing Allied armies. The resistance networks across Belgium shifted their strategies, moving from covert sabotage to open preparation for liberation. The need for small-scale explosives deliveries diminished as larger weapons shipments began arriving through Allied parachute drops and coordinated supply lines. Marie's unique role, the deadly dance she had performed at checkpoints for nearly a year, was becoming obsolete. Marguerite came to Marie's house one evening in late August and told her mother that Marie's services were no longer required, that the network had other methods now, and that the girl had done more than anyone could have asked. She handed Marie's mother an envelope containing money, a small payment that could never adequately compensate for what they had asked a child to do, and left without ceremony or celebration. Marie's initial reaction was relief so intense it felt like physical pain releasing from her body. No more checkpoints, no more nightmares about explosions and interrogations, no more whispering to a doll that contained death. She could return to being just a child, or whatever version of childhood was possible in those final chaotic months of occupation. But relief was quickly followed by something unexpected, a profound sense of emptiness. For nearly a year, Marie had lived with purpose, dangerous and terrifying as it was. She had been important, necessary, a crucial link in a chain of resistance against an overwhelming enemy. Now, suddenly, she was just another child in a country waiting for liberation, her contributions already fading into the background of larger historical events. She found herself missing the weight of the doll in her arms, the adrenaline spike at checkpoints, even the fear that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable. Her mother recognized these symptoms, the difficulty that soldiers face when removed from combat and expected to simply resume normal life. But there were no support systems for child resistance fighters, no therapy or debriefing or recognition. Marie was expected to simply forget, to move on, to pretend that the past year had been just a strange interruption in an otherwise normal childhood. The liberation of Liège came in early September 1944, when American forces rolled through the city, amid scenes of jubilation that Marie watched from her window with strangely muted emotions. People danced in the streets, tore down German signs, embraced the soldiers who had freed them from 4 years of occupation. Marie should have felt joy, should have celebrated the end of the nightmare that had defined her childhood. Instead, she felt disconnected, separated from the celebration by experiences she couldn't share and couldn't explain. Who would believe that a 10-year-old girl had carried explosives through Nazi checkpoints, hidden inside a porcelain doll? Who would understand that she had done it not once but 8 times, that she had looked German soldiers in the eyes while carrying enough dynamite to kill them all, that she had survived through a combination of careful planning and sheer impossible luck? The story seemed absurd, even to Marie herself, now that it was over. Something from a novel rather than real life. Her mother had warned her never to speak of it, explaining that even in liberation there would be questions about how they had survived, accusations of collaboration, demands for proof of resistance activities. Better to stay silent, to blend back into normalcy, to let the story die with the occupation. The doll itself, the porcelain-faced accomplice to 8 missions of sabotage, sat on a shelf in Marie's room, returned to its original purpose as a family heirloom. Marie's mother had carefully restored it, removing all traces of its modifications, filling the body with fresh sawdust, restitching the seams with meticulous care. It looked exactly as it had before the war, serene and innocent, its painted face revealing nothing of the deadly cargo it had once carried. Marie sometimes took it down and held it, trying to reconcile this harmless toy with the weapon it had been, the lives it had helped end, the role it had played in her transformation from child to something else. She wondered about the soldiers at the checkpoints, particularly the sergeant who had squeezed the doll's body and never suspected what he was holding. Had he survived the war? Had he retreated with his unit back to Germany? Or had he died in the Allied advance? Did he ever think about the little girl with the antique doll who had passed through his checkpoint multiple times that year? Probably not. Marie understood that she had been invisible to him beneath his notice, a background detail in his day of processing hundreds of civilians. He would never know how close he had come to discovering a resistance operation, how his assumptions about childhood innocence had been weaponized against him. As the months passed and Belgium began the long process of rebuilding, Marie tried to find her way back to a normal childhood, but the gap between who she had been before the war and who she was now seemed unbridgeable. Other children played games that seemed trivial to Marie. They worried about things that seemed insignificant. They had no framework for understanding what it meant to carry death through enemy checkpoints, to gamble your life on the assumption that innocence was invisible, to shoulder responsibilities that would break most adults. Marie found herself increasingly isolated, unable to connect with peers who had experienced the occupation as victims, but never as fighters. She carried a secret that she could never share, a story that grew heavier with each passing year precisely because it had to remain untold. The resistance networks were being celebrated, their members receiving medals and recognition, their stories published in newspapers and commemorated in ceremonies. But Marie's name appeared nowhere in these accounts. She had been too young, too unofficial, too much of a liability to acknowledge. The handlers who had used her services moved on to other activities, disappeared into post-war anonymity, or died without ever recording her contributions. Marguerite vanished completely, along with the safe house on Rue de la Cathédrale. The network that had depended on Marie simply dissolved, leaving no paper trail, no documentation, no proof that any of it had ever happened. The true scale of what Marie had accomplished only became clear decades later, when historians began piecing together the fragmented records of Belgian resistance operations during the occupation. Among the documents that survived the war were German military reports detailing a series of devastating sabotage attacks on ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, and communication centers in the Liège region between February and August of 1944. These attacks had significantly disrupted German logistics during a critical period when the occupiers were trying to consolidate their defenses against the anticipated Allied invasion. The reports noted with frustration that the explosives used in these operations had somehow been transported through multiple security checkpoints without detection, suggesting that the resistance had developed a smuggling method that German counterintelligence had failed to identify or stop. One report, written by a Gestapo officer in July 1944, specifically mentioned the puzzle of how plastic explosives were moving through the tightest security cordon in the region, passing through checkpoints where every adult was thoroughly searched. The officer proposed various theories: underground tunnels, corruption among checkpoint guards, sophisticated false bottom containers. He never considered the actual answer: a 10-year-old girl with a doll. The explosives that Marie delivered across those 8 missions were distributed to multiple resistance cells and used in coordinated attacks that had strategic impact far beyond their immediate destruction. When the ammunition depot outside Liège exploded in March 1944, it destroyed supplies that were earmarked for German units fighting on the Eastern Front, contributing in a small but measurable way to the shortages that plagued Wehrmacht operations during the Soviet Spring Offensive. When the fuel storage facility burned in May, it forced German military vehicles in the region to operate on reduced rations, limiting their mobility and making them more vulnerable to Allied air attacks. These weren't the dramatic turning points that history books focus on, the famous battles that everyone remembers. They were the 1,000 small cuts that collectively weakened the occupation, the unglamorous work of resistance that made liberation possible when the Allied armies finally arrived. And at the center of this network of sabotage, invisible and unacknowledged, was a child who had risked everything to carry death disguised as innocence through the heart of enemy security. But what haunted Marie more than the operations themselves was the human cost that she only learned about years after the war ended. In 1968, now a middle-aged woman with children of her own, Marie received an unexpected letter from a man who identified himself as a former member of the resistance cell that had used her deliveries. He was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience before the end. His letter contained details about the operations that Marie's explosives had supplied, including one fact that had been carefully hidden from her during the war. Not all of the targets had been purely military. One of the buildings destroyed in a June 1944 operation had been a German administrative office that also housed Belgian civilians who worked as clerks and translators for the occupation authorities. When the explosives detonated, they had killed 12 German soldiers and officers as planned, but they had also killed 7 Belgian civilians who happened to be working late that evening. The resistance had known this would happen. They had calculated that destroying the German command structure in that building was worth the civilian casualties, that collaboration with the occupiers made those Belgians legitimate targets. But they had never told Marie, never let the 10-year-old girl who carried the explosives know that her delivery would kill her own countrymen. Marie's reaction to this letter was complex and remained unresolved for the rest of her life. Part of her understood the brutal mathematics of resistance warfare, the impossible choices that underground fighters had to make when battling an overwhelming occupier. Collaboration was real, and those who worked for the German administration were helping to maintain the machinery of oppression, making them participants in the occupation rather than innocent bystanders. The resistance had to strike at German command and control structures, regardless of who else might be in the building. But another part of Marie, the part that was still that 10-year-old girl clutching a doll, felt a crushing weight of guilt that no rational argument could lift. She had carried death, and that death had killed people who might have been there by choice or might have been there by economic necessity, desperate for any job that would feed their families during the occupation. She would never know their names, never know their stories, never know if they deserved to die for the crime of typing German reports or filing German documents. The moral clarity of resistance, the simple narrative of good versus evil that had sustained her through those checkpoint missions, fractured into something far more complicated and painful. The man's letter included one other piece of information that changed Marie's understanding of her own story. He explained that the Resistance had specifically recruited her, not randomly, but deliberately, because she fit a profile they had developed through trial and error. They needed someone young enough to be dismissed by checkpoint guards, old enough to handle the stress and follow complex instructions, from a family with legitimate reasons to travel that could provide cover for the missions, and living in a location that required passing through the highest security checkpoints where adult smuggling was nearly impossible. Marie had not been chosen for her bravery or patriotism or any noble quality. She had been chosen because she was useful, because her age and appearance and family situation made her an ideal asset for a specific operational need. The handlers had never cared about her as a person, never considered the psychological cost of what they were asking, never planned for what would happen to her after the war ended. She had been a tool, employed efficiently for as long as she was needed, then discarded without ceremony when better tools became available. This realization, arriving decades after the events themselves, was perhaps more painful than any of the checkpoint crossings had been. Marie had built her identity around the belief that she had been a hero, a volunteer in a just cause, a child who had chosen to fight back against evil. Learning that she had actually been a carefully selected asset, manipulated by adults who understood exactly how to exploit her circumstances, fundamentally changed how she understood her own past. Marie never responded to that letter, and the man who wrote it died 3 months later without knowing whether his confession had brought her peace or destroyed it. She kept the letter hidden in a drawer for years, taking it out occasionally to reread when the weight of silence became too heavy to bear alone. Her husband knew nothing of her wartime activities. Her children grew up hearing only vague stories about hardship during the occupation, and her few remaining friends from that era had either died or moved away. The secret that had defined her childhood became a secret that defined her entire adult life, growing more isolating with each passing year. In the 1970s and 80s, as public interest in World War II history surged and oral history projects began recording survivor testimonies, Marie was approached several times by researchers and journalists wanting to document civilian experiences of the occupation. Each time she declined politely, offering only the most general recollections of rationing and curfews, never mentioning checkpoints or dolls or explosives. She told herself it was because the story was too personal, too painful, but the deeper truth was that she no longer knew how to tell it without confronting the moral complexities that had no clean resolution. The doll remained with Marie through all those decades, surviving multiple moves, the deaths of family members, and the passage from one generation to the next. It sat on shelves and in glass cases, admired by grandchildren who saw only a beautiful antique, never suspecting the history it carried. Marie would sometimes catch herself staring at its porcelain face, wondering if objects absorbed the experiences they participated in, if somewhere in the painted features and hollow body there remained an echo of those 8 terrifying journeys. She knew it was irrational, that a doll was just cloth and porcelain without memory or awareness, but the war had taught her that ordinary objects could become extraordinary through the uses to which they were put. This doll had been a weapon more effective than most rifles, a delivery system that had penetrated security designed to stop armies, a testament to the fact that war transforms everything it touches, even children's toys. In her darker moments, Marie considered destroying it, smashing the porcelain face or burning the cloth body, eliminating this physical reminder of a past she couldn't escape. But she never did. The doll was evidence, perhaps the only evidence that still existed, that her story had been real. The turning point came in 1996, when Marie was 62 years old and suffering from the early stages of the heart disease that would eventually kill her. A young historian named Thomas Beaumont was researching unconventional resistance tactics during the occupation and had discovered fragmentary references in German military archives to child couriers being used by Belgian resistance networks. He tracked down Marie through connections with surviving resistance members and showed up at her door with photocopies of German documents, including one that specifically mentioned reports of a young girl repeatedly passing through checkpoints near Liège with suspicious regularity during the spring and summer of 1944. The Germans had noticed her, had even flagged her in their records as a potential person of interest, but by the time they had compiled enough observations to justify a serious investigation, the Allied advance had overtaken the region and the checkpoint system had collapsed. Marie looked at these documents, these pieces of paper that proved she had been visible after all, that her invisibility had been luck rather than certainty, and something broke inside her. For the first time in 5 decades, she told the complete story to someone outside the handful of people who had directly participated in it. Thomas recorded 14 hours of interviews with Marie over the course of 3 months, capturing details that would have been lost forever when she died. He documented the checkpoint procedures, the modifications made to the doll, the psychological tactics used to maintain composure under interrogation, the network of safe houses and handlers, and the aftermath that no one had prepared her for. He asked difficult questions about the moral dimensions of using children in combat roles, about the civilian casualties that resulted from resistance operations, about the long-term psychological costs that Marie had carried alone for most of her life. His approach was respectful but unflinching, treating Marie not as a simple hero to be celebrated, but as a complex human being who had been placed in impossible circumstances and had made the choices available to her. The interviews were painful, but also cathartic, giving Marie the opportunity to finally speak truths that had been locked inside her for longer than most people lived. She cried frequently during these sessions, not from sadness but from the relief of being heard, of having her experience acknowledged as real and significant, rather than dismissed as too incredible to believe or too uncomfortable to discuss. Thomas's resulting book, published in 1998, 2 years after Marie's death, was titled The Invisible Couriers, Child Resistance Fighters in Occupied Belgium. Marie's story occupied an entire chapter, though Thomas had honored her request to use a pseudonym rather than her real name, protecting her family from the complicated legacy she was leaving behind. The book received modest attention in academic circles, but never achieved mainstream success, overshadowed by more dramatic resistance stories involving guns and explosions rather than dolls and checkpoints. Still, it represented something crucial. Marie's story had been recorded, preserved, made part of the historical record in a way that ensured it wouldn't completely disappear. The doll which Marie had bequeathed to Thomas in her will, along with a letter authorizing its use for educational purposes, eventually found its way to the Belgian Resistance Museum in Brussels, where it sits today in a small display case with a placard that reads, "Courier doll circa 1943 to 1944, used by anonymous child resistance member to transport explosives through German checkpoints." One of several unconventional methods employed by Belgian resistance networks during the occupation. Thousands of visitors walk past it every year, most spending only a few seconds glancing at what appears to be an ordinary antique doll, never knowing the full story of the child who carried it into the face of death 8 times and survived to tell no one. The irony that Marie understood but never fully resolved was that her greatest contribution to the war effort came not from the explosives she delivered, but from the operational model she proved viable. After the success of her missions became known within resistance networks, other cells across occupied Europe began experimenting with similar tactics, using children as couriers for weapons, intelligence documents, and sabotage materials. In France, a 13-year-old boy transported detonators hidden inside hollowed-out books through Paris checkpoints for 6 months before being caught and executed. In Holland, sisters aged 9 and 11 ran messages between resistance cells by hiding coded papers inside their schoolbooks, their youth and apparent innocence providing cover for communications that coordinated major sabotage operations. In Poland, children as young as 8 served as lookouts and messengers for the Warsaw Uprising, their small size allowing them to move through rubble and sewers where adults couldn't fit. Marie's story, though never publicly known during the war, had been whispered through underground networks as proof that the impossible was achievable, that the Germans' own assumptions about childhood could be turned against them. She had inadvertently become a template, and that template was replicated across the occupied territories with varying degrees of success and terrible human cost. The children who survived these operations, like Marie, carried scars that remained invisible to a world that preferred to remember the war in terms of soldiers and battles, rather than the moral compromises that resistance required. Post-war Europe had little patience for complicated stories about child combatants, preferring narratives of innocent victims rescued by heroic adults. The psychological damage inflicted on children who had been forced into premature adulthood, who had killed or helped to kill before they were old enough to fully understand death, who had learned to lie and deceive as survival skills, was systematically ignored in the rush to rebuild and move forward. Marie was not unique in her isolation and unresolved trauma. She was part of a hidden cohort of child resistance fighters scattered across Europe, each carrying their own impossible secrets, each struggling to reconcile what they had been asked to do with the childhood they had lost. Some, like Marie, chose silence and spent their lives trying to forget. Others broke under the weight of memory, succumbing to alcoholism, mental illness, or suicide in the decades following the war. A few tried to speak out, to tell their stories to a world that wasn't ready to hear them, and were dismissed as exaggerators or attention seekers, their accounts too disturbing to be incorporated into the comfortable narratives of liberation and victory. The strategic value of Marie's 8 missions, measured in purely military terms, was real but modest. The explosives she delivered contributed to operations that disrupted German logistics and killed enemy personnel, but they didn't change the outcome of the war in any measurable way. The Allies would have won regardless of whether one 10-year-old girl in Belgium had carried dynamite through checkpoints in 1944. This brutal truth, which Marie understood intellectually but never accepted emotionally, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her entire experience. She had sacrificed her childhood, carried trauma that would define her entire adult life, and contributed to operations that killed both enemies and collaborators, all for a cause that would have succeeded without her participation. The resistance handlers who recruited her had needed to believe that every small act of sabotage mattered, that accumulating minor victories would somehow tip the scales toward liberation. And perhaps they were right in aggregate, in the sense that thousands of small acts of resistance collectively weakened the occupation enough to make the final Allied push more successful. But for Marie specifically, for the individual child whose innocence was weaponized and whose psychological well-being was sacrificed for tactical advantage, the cost-benefit calculation was devastating. What Marie never knew, because she died before the full scope of research into wartime child soldiers became available, was that her story was far from unique, even within the specific category of children used as explosive couriers. Archives opened after the Cold War revealed that similar operations had been conducted by resistance movements in at least 7 occupied countries, with varying levels of organization and success. The Soviet partisans fighting behind German lines had used children to transport mines and grenades, exploiting the fact that Wehrmacht soldiers were often reluctant to search young refugees fleeing combat zones. The Yugoslav partisans had incorporated children into their logistics networks, using them to move ammunition through mountainous terrain where their small size and agility provided advantages over adult couriers. Even the German military, in the desperate final months of the war, had used Hitler Youth members as young as 12 to transport Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons through Allied lines, turning children into combatants out of necessity rather than choice. The weaponization of childhood innocence was not a Belgian innovation or a resistance-specific tactic. It was a universal feature of total war, a predictable exploitation of the one resource that both sides consistently undervalued: the lives and well-being of children caught in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The question that historians like Thomas Beaumont struggled with, and that remains unresolved in the academic literature, is whether the use of child couriers like Marie constituted a justified military necessity or a war crime comparable to the atrocities committed by the occupiers. The resistance movements argued that they had no choice, that the occupation forces controlled all conventional supply routes, and that using children was the only viable method to transport materials necessary for operations that saved lives by shortening the war. Critics countered that recruiting children into combat roles, regardless of tactical justification, violated fundamental ethical principles and inflicted psychological damage that persisted long after the military objectives had been achieved. Marie herself never took a clear position on this debate, telling Thomas in one of their final interviews that she didn't have the moral authority to judge the people who had used her, because she understood the desperation that drove their decisions, even as she lived with the consequences of those decisions every day. She could hold both truths simultaneously, that what the resistance had asked of her was necessary, and that it was wrong, that she had been a hero, and that she had been a victim, that her sacrifice had mattered, and that it shouldn't have been required. War, she had learned, didn't resolve into clean moral categories. It was messy, complicated, and destructive in ways that couldn't be adequately captured by simple narratives of good versus evil. Today, the doll sits behind glass in the Belgian Resistance Museum, a silent artifact of a war that grows more distant with each passing year. Visitors who pause to read the placard rarely grasp the full weight of what they're seeing. Not just a cleverly modified toy, but a symbol of how total war transforms everything it touches, how desperation breeds innovation that crosses ethical lines, and how the youngest and most vulnerable are often conscripted into conflicts they didn't create and couldn't escape. The museum receives occasional requests from filmmakers and documentary producers interested in dramatizing Marie's story, but her family, honoring her final wishes, has consistently refused permission to use her real name or identifying details. Marie wanted the story told, wanted future generations to understand what resistance actually looked like beyond the romanticized versions, but she didn't want glory or recognition. She had learned too much about the moral complexity of her own actions to accept simple hero worship. The doll remains, authenticated and preserved, one of the few physical pieces of evidence that child couriers existed and operated successfully throughout the occupation. What makes Marie's story particularly important in 2025, 8 decades after the events themselves, is not its uniqueness, but its universality. In conflicts around the world today, children continue to be weaponized, conscripted, and exploited by forces that see them as tactical assets rather than human beings deserving protection. The specific circumstances change, the technologies evolve, the ideologies differ, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. Adults in desperate circumstances make choices that sacrifice children's well-being for perceived military or political necessity. Marie's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we remember resistance, how we celebrate historical victories, and what costs we're willing to accept in the name of fighting tyranny. The Allies won the war, the occupation ended, Belgium was liberated, and in the grand narrative of World War II, these outcomes justified almost any sacrifice. But for Marie, who lived 52 more years after her final checkpoint crossing, the victory was complicated by knowledge that couldn't be forgotten and trauma that couldn't be healed. The historical amnesia surrounding child resistance fighters like Marie isn't accidental. Post-war societies needed clean narratives of heroism and liberation, stories that could unite divided populations and provide moral clarity in the face of unprecedented destruction. Children carrying explosives through checkpoints didn't fit that narrative comfortably. They raised questions about who bears responsibility for the decisions made under occupation, whether the ends justified the means, and what we owe to the people who sacrificed their innocence for causes they were too young to fully understand. By forgetting these stories, by allowing them to fade into obscurity or be reduced to brief museum placards, we avoid confronting the full moral complexity of resistance warfare. We get to maintain simple narratives where adults made heroic sacrifices and children were protected victims, rather than acknowledging the messier reality where children were recruited as soldiers and paid psychological prices that lasted lifetimes. Marie died in 1996, believing that her story didn't matter, that it was too small and too compromised to deserve remembrance alongside the famous acts of resistance that filled history books. She was wrong. Her story matters precisely because it's uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask difficult questions, because it reminds us that war's casualties aren't limited to the people who die in combat, but include everyone who survives carrying pieces of shattered innocence that can never be made whole. The little girl who walked through Nazi checkpoints with dynamite hidden in her grandmother's porcelain doll wasn't just fighting Germans. She was navigating an impossible situation created by adults, doing what she was told would save lives, and paying a price that no accounting could ever balance. Her story deserves to be remembered not because it's inspiring, but because it's true, and because forgetting it makes it easier to repeat the same patterns in future conflicts. The doll behind the glass in Brussels is more than a curious historical artifact. It's a warning, a question and a memorial to all the children who fought wars they didn't start, and received no recognition for sacrifices they never should have been asked to make.